Sarah Chen wiped the grease from her hands as she finished checking the last vehicle in the motor pool. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the military compound, and sweat mixed with oil stains on her uniform. To everyone around her, she was just another mechanic keeping the trucks and armored vehicles running in this remote outpost near the Syrian border. The other soldiers barely noticed her. She was quiet, efficient, and always had her head buried under a hood or crawling beneath a chassis. They saw the tools in her hands, heard her muttering about engine problems, and assumed that was all there was to Sarah Chen. They had no idea about the classified files hidden in her personnel folder or the specialized training she had received before being assigned to this supposedly routine maintenance position. Captain Rodriguez approached her workstation, his boots crunching on the sandy ground. "Chen, we've got a convoy heading out tomorrow morning. I need all vehicles checked and ready by 0600. He barely looked at her as he spoke, already turning to leave. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and unremarkable. She watched him walk away, noting how he moved, where he positioned himself, how he interacted with the other soldiers. These details mattered more than anyone realized. As evening approached, Sarah made her way to the communications tent. She needed to check on a reported radio malfunction in one of the Humvees. The tent was empty except for Private Martinez, who was monitoring the radio chatter from headquarters. He nodded at her without much interest as she began examining the radio equipment. While her hands worked on the connections, her ears picked up fragments of conversation coming through the encrypted channels. Words like asset, extraction, and compromised position caught her attention. She continued working, appearing focused on the technical problem, but every word was being processed and filed away in her memory. The radio crackled to life with an urgent message. Intelligence had intercepted communications suggesting that hostile forces were planning an assault on their position. The attack was expected within the next 48 hours. Sarah's hands never paused in their work, but her mind was already shifting into a different mode of operation. Private Martinez looked nervous as he relayed the message to the command post. Sarah finished her repairs and quietly left the tent, but she had heard enough. The pieces were falling into place, and she recognized the pattern. This wasn't just a random attack on a military outpost. Someone had been feeding information to the enemy, and their unit was walking into a carefully planned trap. Back in her quarters, Sarah sat on her narrow bunk and stared at the wall. Her roommate was on duty, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She thought about the mission briefing she had received months ago, before she had been assigned to this unit. Her real job wasn't fixing engines and changing oil. She was here to identify and neutralize a security threat that had been plaguing coalition forces in the region. The threat was real and immediate. Intelligence suggested that someone within their own ranks was providing detailed information about troop movements, patrol schedules, and defensive positions to enemy forces. Several units had suffered devastating losses after walking into perfectly planned ambushes. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. Sarah had been chosen for this assignment because of her unique background. Before joining the military, she had grown up in her father's auto repair shop, learning to fix anything with an engine. But her military training had taken her in a very different direction. She was a specialist in counterintelligence and covert operations, with additional training in close-quarters combat and silent elimination techniques. Her mechanical skills provided the perfect cover for her real mission. She could move freely around the base, accessing vehicles, equipment, and communication systems without raising suspicion. She could observe personnel, track their movements, and identify patterns that might reveal the identity of the traitor in their midst. Now, as she prepared for sleep, Sarah knew that time was running out. The enemy attack was imminent, and she still hadn't identified the source of the intelligence leak. But the intercepted communications had given her new information to work with. Someone in their unit was planning to ensure that the defensive preparations would fail when the attack came. She closed her eyes and began reviewing everything she had observed over the past few weeks. Every conversation, every unusual behavior, every small detail that had seemed out of place. Somewhere in that information was the key to identifying the traitor before it was too late. The lives of everyone in the unit depended on her ability to solve this puzzle and take action before the trap was sprung. The next morning arrived with an unusual tension hanging over the compound. Sarah started her day early, beginning her routine maintenance checks while most of the unit was still having breakfast. She moved methodically from vehicle to vehicle, but her real attention was focused on the patterns of behavior around her. Sergeant Williams emerged from the command tent looking agitated. He had been acting strangely for the past week, making frequent trips to areas of the base where he normally had no business.
Sarah had noticed him near the communications equipment on several occasions.
Always with a reasonable excuse, but often when he thought no one was watching. As she worked under the hood of a supply truck, Sarah listened to the conversations happening around her. The soldiers were discussing the upcoming patrol schedules and defensive positions with nervous energy. Everyone knew that an attack was coming, but they were trying to maintain normal operations while preparing for the worst. Lieutenant Foster approached her workstation carrying a clipboard and looking official. "Chen, I need you to check the communications array on the main gate tower. There's been some interference with the long-range transmissions." He handed her the work order without making eye contact, which was typical for most officers who barely acknowledged the support personnel. Sarah nodded and gathered her tools, but something about the request felt off. The communications array had been working perfectly when she had tested it just 2 days earlier. More importantly, Lieutenant Foster had been asking her to check various communication systems more frequently than seemed necessary for routine maintenance. She climbed the ladder to the tower platform, her tool bag slung over her shoulder. The view from up there gave her a clear sight line across the entire compound and the surrounding desert landscape. As she began examining the equipment, she noticed movement in the distance. Dust clouds on the horizon suggested vehicles approaching from multiple directions. While appearing to work on the antenna connections, Sarah used the elevated position to observe the activity below. She watched as different members of the unit went about their duties, noting who went where and when. Her trained eye picked up subtle details that others would miss. The way someone moved, where they positioned themselves, how they interacted with different groups of people. Sergeant Williams was at the motor pool, supposedly checking on vehicle readiness. But Sarah noticed that he spent more time looking at his watch and scanning the perimeter than examining the equipment. When he thought no one was looking, he pulled out a small device and appeared to be sending some kind of signal. Sarah's suspicions crystallized in that moment. She had been watching Williams for days, and his behavior pattern finally made complete sense. The frequent trips to restricted areas, the nervous energy, the way he positioned himself to observe activities without participating. He was gathering intelligence and reporting. Back to someone outside the compound, she finished her work on the communications array quickly and climbed down from the tower. As she walked back across the compound, she passed close enough to Williams to see what he was holding. It was a satellite communication device, definitely not standard military issue. He quickly concealed it when he saw her approaching. "Everything running smooth, Sergeant?" Sarah asked in her usual casual manner, gesturing toward the vehicles. "Yeah, Chen, all good here," Williams replied, but his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there before. "You get that comm problem sorted out?" "Just a loose connection," Sarah said, maintaining her cover as the simple mechanic who only cared about fixing things. But internally, she was processing this confirmation of her suspicions and beginning to plan her next moves. The afternoon brought increased activity as the unit prepared for the expected attack. Defensive positions were reinforced, ammunition was distributed, and patrol schedules were adjusted. Sarah continued her normal duties, but she was also tracking Williams' movements and looking for opportunities to confirm what she already suspected. Her chance came during the evening meal. Williams excused himself from the dining area, claiming he needed to check on the perimeter guards. Sarah waited a few minutes, then followed him at a distance. She moved carefully, using her knowledge of the compound layout to stay out of sight while maintaining visual contact. Williams made his way to a storage building on the edge of the compound. Sarah positioned herself behind a supply trailer where she could observe without being seen. Through the small window, she watched as Williams pulled out the satellite communication device and began transmitting information. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Williams consulting a piece of paper and speaking in urgent, whispered tones. After several minutes, he ended the transmission and carefully concealed the device before heading back toward the main compound. Sarah waited until he was well clear of the area before moving closer to the building. Inside the storage facility, she found evidence that confirmed her worst fears. Hidden behind some equipment crates was a detailed map of the compound, showing defensive positions, patrol routes, and personnel assignments. Written notes in Williams' handwriting provided specific times and locations that would be most vulnerable to attack. Sarah photographed the evidence with a small camera she carried for her real mission, then carefully returned everything to its original position. Williams couldn't know that his activities had been discovered, not yet. She needed to time her next actions carefully to maximize the chance of stopping the attack and protecting her fellow soldiers. As she made her way back to her quarters, Sarah's mind was already working through the tactical situation. The enemy attack would come soon, probably during the early morning hours when visibility was poor and most personnel would be at their least alert. Williams would ensure that the defensive preparations were compromised at exactly the right moment, but Sarah had one advantage that Williams didn't know about. She wasn't just a mechanic who had stumbled across his betrayal. She was a highly trained operative who had been sent specifically to deal with this kind of threat. Tomorrow, when the trap was sprung, Williams would discover that he had seriously underestimated the quiet woman who spent her days covered in grease and oil. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay on her bunk listening to the sounds of the compound settling into its nighttime routine, but her mind was busy finalizing the plan that would save her unit from the trap that was about to be sprung. Every detail had to be perfect because she would only get one chance to act before the enemy attack began. At 0300 hours, she quietly got dressed and slipped out of her quarters. The night guards were making their regular rounds, but Sarah knew their patterns after weeks of observation. She moved through the shadows between buildings, avoiding the patrol routes and security cameras with the skill of someone trained in covert operations. Her first stop was the armory. Using skills that definitely weren't taught in mechanic school, Sarah bypassed the lock and slipped inside. She needed specific equipment for what was coming, gear that wasn't part of her official maintenance kit. From a hidden compartment that she had prepared weeks earlier, she retrieved night vision goggles, a suppressed pistol, and a combat knife. Next, she made her way to the communications center. The night operator was dozing at his station, and Sarah moved past him without making a sound. She accessed the computer system and began downloading the transmission logs from the past week. The data would provide proof of Williams' treachery, but more importantly, it might reveal details about the timing and scope of the coming attack. As she worked, Sarah heard footsteps approaching the communications tent. She quickly finished the download and concealed herself behind a bank of equipment just as Williams entered. He moved confidently through the facility, clearly familiar with the layout and security procedures. Sarah watched as Williams accessed the radio equipment and began transmitting on an encrypted frequency. His voice was quiet but urgent as he provided final updates on the compound's defensive status. She listened carefully, memorizing every detail of the information he was giving to the enemy forces. All defensive positions confirmed, Williams whispered into the microphone. Guard rotation changes at 500. Northern perimeter will be minimum. Strength from 05115 to 0530. Recommend primary assault during that window. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized how thoroughly Williams had compromised their security. He wasn't just providing general information about the base layout. He was giving the enemy real-time intelligence about their defensive weaknesses and the exact timing to exploit them. Williams continued his transmission, providing details about ammunition storage locations, the position of heavy weapons, and the number of personnel assigned to each defensive sector. Sarah realized that without intervention, the coming attack would be a massacre. The enemy would know exactly where to strike and when the defenders would be most vulnerable. After Williams finished his transmission and left the communications center, Sarah emerged from her hiding place. She had heard enough to understand the full scope of the threat, and she knew that conventional security measures wouldn't be sufficient to stop what was coming. The enemy had too much detailed information, and Williams was still in position to provide updates and sabotage defensive efforts. Sarah made her way to the compound's central observation post, a position that would give her the best view of the surrounding area and the ability to coordinate her response to the attack. She settled into a concealed position and began her final preparations. Using the intelligence she had gathered, Sarah plotted the most likely approach routes for the enemy forces. Williams had provided them with detailed information about patrol schedules and defensive positions, so they would avoid the strongest points and concentrate their attack on the identified weaknesses. As dawn approached, Sarah spotted the first signs of movement in the desert. Dust clouds appeared on multiple horizons, indicating that enemy forces were converging on the compound from several directions simultaneously. The attack was beginning exactly as Williams had coordinated. Sarah activated her communication device and sent a coded message to her handlers, informing them that the trap was about to be sprung and that she was implementing emergency protocols. From this point forward, she would be operating under rules of engagement that gave her complete authority to neutralize any threat to the mission. The first enemy vehicles appeared in the distance, moving in coordinated formations that suggested professional military training and detailed knowledge of the terrain. Sarah counted at least 50 hostile combatants approaching from 3 different directions, with more forces probably held in reserve. She watched as Williams emerged from the command bunker and positioned himself at one of the defensive positions. To anyone observing, he appeared to be taking his assigned role in the compound's defense. But Sarah noticed that he had positioned himself where he could observe the defensive response and potentially interfere with communications or weapons systems at crucial moments. The time for surveillance and intelligence gathering was over. In the next few minutes, the enemy forces would begin their assault, and Williams would act to ensure that their attack succeeded. Sarah checked her equipment one final time and began moving toward her first target. She had spent weeks observing and planning, but now she had to act with deadly precision. The lives of everyone in the compound depended on her ability to eliminate the internal threat and disrupt the enemy attack before her fellow soldiers realized what was happening. Sarah moved through the compound like a shadow, using every piece of cover and concealment to avoid detection. Her real training was finally being put to use, and the quiet mechanic was about to reveal skills that would shock anyone who had known her only as the woman who fixed their vehicles. The trap was indeed springing, but it wasn't going to work the way Williams and his enemy contacts had planned. They had underestimated their target, and they were about to pay a deadly price for that mistake. The first enemy sniper took position on a ridge overlooking the compound, just as the sun began to rise. Sarah spotted the glint of his scope through her night vision equipment and immediately understood that the attack was beginning with precision strikes, designed to eliminate key defensive personnel before the main assault. She moved silently across the compound, staying low and using vehicles and equipment for cover. Her suppressed pistol was ready, but she knew that even silenced weapons would eventually alert others to her activities. She needed to work quickly and efficiently, eliminating threats without raising an alarm that would compromise her mission. Williams was at his assigned defensive position, but Sarah noticed that he was making subtle adjustments to the mounted machine gun that would reduce its effectiveness. He appeared to be performing routine maintenance, but his actions were actually sabotaging the weapon system at the crucial moment when it would be needed most. Sarah approached Williams's position from behind, moving through the shadows cast by the early morning sun. Her combat training guided every step, every movement calculated to avoid detection until it was too late for her target to react. She was now operating in her true role as a special operations eliminationist. "Sergeant Williams," she said quietly as she reached striking distance. Williams turned toward her voice, probably expecting to see the familiar mechanic with some routine question about equipment. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman whose entire demeanor had changed. The quiet, unassuming maintenance worker was gone, replaced by someone who radiated lethal competence. "Chen, what are you doing here?" "You should be in the shelters," Williams said. But his voice carried a note of uncertainty as he recognized that something was fundamentally different about the situation. "I know about the communications device," Sarah said simply. "I know about the map. I know about the transmission you made 3 hours ago." Williams' face went through a series of expressions as he processed what she was saying. Confusion gave way to understanding, then to fear as he realized that his carefully constructed cover had been blown. His hand moved toward his sidearm, but Sarah was already inside his reach. The combat knife appeared in her hand as if by magic, and Williams had only a split second to understand that the mechanic he had dismissed and ignored was actually a highly trained killer. He never had a chance to draw his weapon or call for help. Sarah's strike was precise and silent, and Williams collapsed without making a sound. She quickly searched his body and found the satellite communication device, along with detailed notes about the compound's defenses and a schedule for the incoming attack. The information confirmed her analysis of the enemy's plan and provided additional details about their numbers and equipment. Sarah dragged Williams's body into a storage shed where it wouldn't be discovered until after the battle was over. She took his radio and identification, knowing that she might need to use his credentials to access restricted areas or communication systems. During the coming fight, the sound of distant explosions reached her ears as the enemy forces began their preliminary bombardment. Mortar rounds were falling on the compound's outer perimeter, creating diversions and forcing the defenders to spread their attention across multiple threats. This was exactly the kind of coordinated attack that required detailed intelligence to execute effectively. Sarah moved to a better observation position and began identifying enemy targets through her scope. The attacking forces were professional and well-equipped, moving in tactical formations that suggested extensive training and planning. They knew exactly where to position themselves to avoid the compound's defensive strongpoints. She spotted the enemy commander coordinating the attack from a concealed position behind a rock formation. He was using radio communications to direct his forces, and Sarah could see that he had detailed maps and plans spread out around his position. Taking him out would disrupt their coordination, but he was too far away for her pistol and too well protected for a direct approach. Instead, Sarah focused on the immediate threats that were closer to the compound. Enemy soldiers were advancing under cover of the mortar bombardment, moving toward predetermined positions that would give them clear fields of fire into the defensive positions. Their movements showed that they knew exactly where the weak points were. She identified her first target, an enemy soldier carrying a radio pack who was coordinating the movements of a squad moving toward the northern perimeter. Williams had specifically mentioned that area as being vulnerable during the guard rotation change. Sarah moved to intercept them. The enemy squad was advancing through a drainage ditch that provided excellent cover from observation by the main defensive positions. But Sarah had positioned herself at a point where the ditch curved, giving her a clear view of their approach route. She waited until they were committed to their movement before acting. Her first shot took down the radio operator before he could call for support. The suppressed pistol made almost no sound, and the other squad members didn't immediately realize what had happened. Sarah moved to a new position and took aim at the squad leader. The second shot dropped the squad leader just as he began to realize that they were under attack. The remaining soldiers started to take cover and look for threats, but they were looking in the wrong direction. Sarah had already moved again, using the terrain and her knowledge of the compound to stay ahead of their response. One by one, she eliminated the remaining members of the squad with precise, silent shots. Within 5 minutes, an entire enemy unit had been neutralized without alerting any other attacking forces to her presence. Sarah collected their radio equipment and weapons, gathering intelligence about the overall attack plan. The radio chatter revealed that multiple squads were moving toward predetermined positions around the compound perimeter. Each squad had specific objectives and timing, all coordinated based on the intelligence that Williams had provided. But now that coordination was beginning to break down as squads failed to report in according to schedule. Sarah began hunting the next target, moving through the compound like a deadly shadow while the main battle raged around her. The other defenders were responding to the obvious threats, the mortar bombardment and the enemy forces they could see. But they had no idea that their greatest protection was coming from the quiet mechanic who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. The enemy's second wave came exactly 15 minutes after the first, just as their intercepted communications had indicated. Sarah had used that time to reposition herself at a critical choke point where multiple attack routes converged. She watched through her scope as another squad of enemy soldiers moved toward the compound's weak points with the confidence of troops who believed they had perfect intelligence. This squad was larger and better equipped than the first. They carried heavy weapons and explosives, clearly intended to breach the compound's main defenses once they reached their assigned positions. Their leader moved with the authority of someone who had studied detailed maps and reconnaissance photos of the target area. Sarah counted 8 combatants in this group, too many to engage simultaneously with her pistol. She needed a different approach that would allow her to eliminate them without alerting other enemy forces to her presence. The solution came from her knowledge of the compound's infrastructure systems. Moving quickly through maintenance tunnels that she had mapped during her weeks of preparation, Sarah reached the compound's main electrical distribution panel. She had modified the system weeks earlier, installing remote switches that would allow her to control power to different sections of the base. Now she activated those modifications. The lights went out in the section where the enemy squad was advancing, plunging them into darkness just as they reached their attack position. Sarah heard confused voices and the sound of equipment being adjusted as the enemy soldiers tried to adapt to the unexpected change in conditions. Using her night vision equipment, Sarah moved into the darkened area where the enemy squad was now struggling to maintain their coordination. She could see them clearly while they were effectively blind. Her first target was the squad's heavy weapons specialist, whose machine gun posed the greatest threat to the compound's defenders. The suppressed pistol whispered twice, and the machine gunner dropped silently to the ground. Sarah was already moving to her next position before the other squad members realized what had happened. The darkness and their confusion provided perfect cover for her operations. Her next target was the squad leader, who was trying to re-establish communication with his command element. Sarah approached from behind, using her combat knife instead of the pistol to avoid even the minimal sound of the suppressed weapon. The leader collapsed without making a sound. One by one, she eliminated the remaining squad members with clinical efficiency. Each kill was silent and precise, designed to prevent any warning from reaching the other attacking forces. Within 10 minutes, the entire squad had been neutralized, and Sarah had collected their heavy weapons and explosives for potential use against other enemy positions. The radio traffic she intercepted revealed growing confusion among the enemy forces. Multiple squads were failing to reach their assigned positions or report in according to schedule. The attack plan that had been based on perfect intelligence was beginning to fall apart as key elements simply disappeared. Sarah restored power to the compound and moved to her next target area. Through intercepted communications, she had identified the location of the enemy's command post, positioned on high ground overlooking the compound. The commander was becoming increasingly agitated as his carefully planned assault failed to develop according to schedule. Reaching the command post required a dangerous movement across open ground that was under observation by enemy forces, but Sarah had identified a route that used natural terrain features and abandoned equipment for concealment. She moved carefully, taking advantage of every piece of cover while monitoring enemy communications for signs that she had been detected. The command post was well defended, with sentries positioned to watch all approach routes and communication equipment that kept the commander in contact with his scattered forces. Sarah counted 6 personnel at the site, including the commander, his communications specialist, and 4 security guards. She needed to eliminate all 6 without allowing any of them to send a warning to the remaining attack forces. This required perfect timing and coordination of multiple simultaneous actions. Sarah positioned herself where she could engage multiple targets quickly, while having escape routes available if the situation went wrong. Her first shot took down the farthest sentry, who was positioned to watch the main approach route. Before his body hit the ground, Sarah had shifted aim and eliminated the communications specialist, cutting the command post's ability to coordinate with other enemy forces. The suppressed pistol allowed her to engage both targets before anyone realized they were under attack. The remaining personnel began to react to the threat, but they were looking in the wrong direction and couldn't see their attacker in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah moved to a new position and continued her methodical elimination of the command element. Each shot was carefully aimed and timed to prevent any organized response. The enemy commander was her final target at the position. He had taken cover behind communication equipment and was trying to use a backup radio to contact his forces. Sarah's final shot at the command post ended his transmission mid-sentence, leaving the remaining enemy forces without coordination or leadership. With the command post eliminated, Sarah collected the enemy's detailed assault plans and communication codes. The intelligence revealed that additional enemy forces were positioned as reserves, waiting for orders to commit to the attack once the initial assault succeeded. Without command coordination, those reserves would remain inactive and confused. Sarah activated her own communication device and sent a coded message to her handlers, providing a brief status report on her progress. The message was acknowledged immediately, confirming that her actions were being monitored and approved by higher authority. She was authorized to continue operations until all threats were eliminated. The main battle at the compound continued, but the attacking forces were now operating without coordination or leadership. What had been planned as a carefully Orchestrated assault was degenerating into confused and ineffective attacks by scattered groups that no longer understood their objectives or timing. Sarah checked her ammunition and equipment, then began moving toward her next target area. She had eliminated nearly half of the attacking force without firing a single shot that her fellow defenders could hear. The enemy's perfect trap was turning into a disaster, and they still had no idea what was happening to their carefully laid plans. With the enemy command structure eliminated, Sarah turned her attention to the reserve forces that were positioned to exploit any breakthrough in the compound's defenses. These troops were more experienced and better equipped than the initial assault waves, held back to deliver the decisive blow once the defensive positions had been weakened. Through intercepted radio communications, Sarah had learned that the reserves were positioned in 3 separate locations around the compound perimeter. Each group was waiting for specific signals to advance, signals that would never come now that their command post had been eliminated. But Sarah knew that eventually these forces would recognize the failure of the main assault and adapt their tactics accordingly. The first reserve position was located in a wadi approximately 800 meters from the compound's eastern gate. Sarah approached the position using a dry stream bed that provided concealment from observation, while allowing her to get close enough for effective engagement. Her movements were silent and deliberate, guided by years of training in covert approach techniques. She reached an observation position where she could see the entire reserve force without being detected. 12 enemy soldiers were positioned around several vehicles, including a technical truck mounted with a heavy machine gun. Their discipline was good, and they maintained proper security while waiting for orders from their command element. Sarah realized that eliminating this group would require a different approach than the silent takedowns she had been using. The reserve forces were alert and positioned in open ground where individual infiltration would be nearly impossible. Instead, she decided to use the explosives she had taken from the eliminated assault squads. Moving carefully around the perimeter of the enemy position, Sarah placed improvised explosive devices at strategic locations that would maximize casualties, while preventing any survivors from escaping to warn other forces. The placement required her to move within meters of enemy sentries, but her training in stealth movement allowed her to complete the task without detection. When the explosives detonated simultaneously, the reserve position was completely destroyed. The vehicles exploded in secondary detonations that sent flames and smoke high into the morning sky. No enemy soldiers survived the coordinated blasts, and Sarah was already moving toward the second reserve position before the sound of the explosions had finished echoing across the desert. The second reserve force was positioned in rocky terrain that provided better cover and concealment than the first location. Sarah approached through a series of boulder formations, using the natural terrain to mask her movement while getting close enough to assess the enemy's strength and positioning. This group was smaller but more heavily armed, with advanced weapons and communication equipment that suggested they were intended as a rapid reaction force. 8 soldiers were positioned around heavy weapons emplacements, with clear fields of fire that would allow them to support the main assault or respond to unexpected threats. Sarah noticed that this group was already showing signs of concern about the lack of communication from their command element. The team leader was repeatedly trying to establish radio contact, and the soldiers were becoming increasingly alert. As time passed without receiving expected updates on the battle's progress, rather than risk a direct assault on this well-positioned force, Sarah decided to use psychological warfare combined with precision targeting. She positioned herself at extreme range and began eliminating the enemy soldiers one by one with carefully aimed shots from a rifle she had taken from one of the earlier engagements. Her first shot took down the team leader just as he was preparing to move his force toward the compound. The remaining soldiers immediately took cover and began scanning for threats, but Sarah was positioned beyond their effective range and concealed in terrain that made her nearly impossible to spot. Over the next 15 minutes, Sarah systematically eliminated the entire reserve force with precision shots that gave them no opportunity to locate or engage her position. Each shot was carefully aimed and timed to prevent any coordinated response, and the enemy soldiers were eliminated without being able to return effective fire. The third reserve position proved to be the most challenging. This group was positioned in prepared fighting positions with excellent cover and overlapping fields of fire. They had already received fragmentary reports about problems with the main assault, and they were in a high state of readiness when Sarah approached their area. Recognizing that a direct approach would be too dangerous, Sarah decided to use the compound's own defensive systems against this final enemy force. During her weeks of preparation, she had identified ways to redirect some of the base's automated defenses to engage targets outside the perimeter. Moving back toward the compound, Sarah accessed a maintenance panel for the perimeter defense system and reprogrammed the automated targeting sensors. The system was designed to engage hostile forces that approached too close to the compound, but with the right modifications, it could be directed against specific coordinates where the reserve force was positioned. The automated defense system engaged with devastating effect. Heavy machine guns and grenade launchers that had been installed to protect the compound were now directed against the final enemy reserve position. The sustained fire eliminated the entire force within minutes, leaving no survivors to retreat or report on what had happened. With all enemy forces eliminated or neutralized, Sarah began the process of consolidating her position and preparing for potential follow-up attacks. She moved through the areas where she had engaged enemy forces, collecting intelligence materials and ensuring that no hostile personnel had survived to pose continued threats. The radio traffic she monitored revealed complete confusion among any remaining enemy elements in the area. The carefully planned assault had been completely disrupted, with all attack forces eliminated and no clear understanding of what had gone wrong. The enemy's perfect intelligence had become useless, and their coordinated assault had turned into a complete disaster. Sarah activated her communication device and sent a comprehensive status report to her handlers. 53 enemy combatants had been eliminated, along with all of their vehicles and heavy equipment. The compound was secure and the immediate threat had been neutralized. Her mission parameters had been exceeded and the security breach represented by Williams had been permanently resolved. As the sun rose fully over the compound, Sarah began the process of transitioning back to her cover identity. Soon her fellow soldiers would begin to realize that the expected assault had failed to materialize, and she needed to be ready to resume her role as the quiet mechanic who had spent the morning maintaining vehicles and equipment. By mid-morning, the compound was buzzing with confused activity, as soldiers tried to understand what had happened during the night. The expected enemy assault had never materialized in any recognizable form. There had been distant explosions and some radio chatter about possible threats, but no coordinated attack had reached the defensive positions. Sarah was back in the motor pool, her uniform once again stained with grease and oil, working under the hood of a Humvee as if she had been there all morning. When Captain Rodriguez approached her workstation, she looked up with the same unremarkable expression that everyone had come to expect from the quiet mechanic. "Chen, did you hear all that commotion last night?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying the tension of someone who had spent hours preparing for a battle that never came. "Some explosions out in the desert, sir," Sarah replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "Figured it was just training exercises or maybe ordnance disposal. Didn't seem like anything that would affect the vehicles." Rodriguez nodded absently, but his attention was clearly focused on larger concerns. "Have you seen Sergeant Williams this morning? He was supposed to report for debriefing an hour ago." Sarah maintained her innocent expression while providing the carefully prepared response. "No, sir, haven't seen him since yesterday evening. Maybe he's still checking the perimeter positions." "Maybe," Rodriguez said, but his tone suggested growing concern. "If you see him, tell him I need to speak with him immediately." As the day progressed, the mystery of the missing enemy attack and the absent Sergeant Williams became the primary topics of conversation throughout the compound. Search parties were organized to look for Williams, while intelligence personnel tried to piece together what had happened to the expected assault. Sarah continued her normal duties, but she was also monitoring the investigation and ensuring that her actions from the previous night remained undetected. She had carefully planned every aspect of her operations to avoid leaving evidence that would compromise her cover or reveal the true nature of what had occurred. The search parties that ventured into the desert found evidence of the destroyed enemy forces, but the scene looked like the result of internal conflicts or accidental explosions, rather than military action by the compound's defenders. The bodies and equipment were scattered and damaged in ways that suggested multiple separate incidents, rather than a coordinated defensive response. When Williams's body was finally discovered in the storage shed, the situation became even more confusing for the investigators. There were no obvious signs of struggle or violence, and his death appeared to be the result of a medical emergency rather than enemy action. The investigation would eventually conclude that he had suffered a heart attack while performing his duties during the crisis. Sarah observed these developments with professional detachment while maintaining her role as a concerned member of the unit. She participated in the discussions about what might have happened, offering the same speculation and theories as everyone else, while carefully avoiding any statements that might draw attention to her actual knowledge of the events. 3 days after the incident, Sarah received new orders transferring her to another assignment. The transfer was routine and unremarkable, just another mechanic being moved to where her skills were needed. No one in the unit thought to question why their quiet maintenance specialist was leaving so soon after the mysterious events. As she packed her gear and prepared to leave the compound, Sarah reflected on the mission that had brought her to this place. The security breach had been identified and eliminated, the enemy assault had been neutralized, and the lives of her fellow soldiers had been protected. The mission had been completed successfully without compromising her cover or revealing the true capabilities that had made her success possible. Captain Rodriguez came to see her off, expressing the routine appreciation that commanders offered to departing personnel. "Good luck at your new assignment, Chen. You kept our vehicles running when we needed them most." "Just doing my job." "Sir?" Sarah replied with the same modest demeanor she had maintained throughout her time at the compound. As her transport vehicle pulled away from the compound, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Behind her, the other soldiers were returning to their normal routines, completely unaware that their lives had been saved by the quiet woman they had barely noticed. The enemy's perfect trap had been turned against them by someone they had never suspected existed. Sarah's personnel file would record her time at the compound as routine maintenance duty with no significant incidents. There would be no medals or recognition for what she had accomplished, no public acknowledgement of the threat that had been eliminated. That was exactly how she preferred it. Her next assignment was already waiting, another situation where a quiet mechanic would be needed to observe, assess, and protect. Sarah Chen had proven once again that the most dangerous person in any situation might be the one that everyone overlooks. The enemy had learned this lesson too late, and the 50 hostile operatives would never have the chance to share what they had discovered about underestimating the unit's mechanic. The trap had indeed been sprung, but not in the way anyone had expected. In the deadly game of military intelligence and covert operations, Sarah had demonstrated that sometimes the best weapon is the one that nobody sees coming.